remember anymore. It was a really tight moment, and I knew that if I didn't go for it, Nikki would go for it. And it's one of those days where a little bit of luck and intention was what got me through. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
She walked onto that court carrying something that could not be seen, but could definitely be felt. A pressure built over years, a pattern that followed her from tournament to tournament, and a label that fans and analysts had quietly started attaching to her without ever saying it directly to her face. Because every time Alex Eala faced a Czech opponent, the results seemed to fall into the same direction. And going into the Birmingham Open final, that entire history was sitting right behind her. Like a shadow she could not outrun. 13 matches, 13 defeats, and even though each match had its own story, its own scoreline, its own circumstances, the pattern remained the same. And that is what made this final feel different before even a single ball was struck. Because sometimes in sports it is not just about who is playing better in the moment, it is about everything that has happened before the moment arrives. And from the first few games of the final, you could already feel that tension starting to build again. Her opponent stepping in with no fear, striking the ball clean, taking early control of rallies, pushing Alex into defensive positions, testing her movement on grass, where one small misstep can completely change a point, and slowly building scoreboard pressure until the first set started slipping away. And when it finally ended 7-5 against her, it didn't feel like just losing a set. It felt like history trying to repeat itself in real time, because that number in the background, that 0-13 record against Czech players, suddenly felt heavier than the match itself. And for a brief moment, it looked like the same script was about to play out again. Frustration starting to creep in, momentum tilting, crowd energy shifting, and every small error beginning to feel magnified under pressure. But what separates players who remain stuck in patterns from players who eventually break through them is not how they feel when everything is going well, but what they do when everything starts going wrong. And in the second set, something changed in a way that was not dramatic, but extremely important. Because instead of reacting emotionally or rushing to fix things quickly, she slowed the match down in her own way, started building points with more structure, using her left-handed serve not just as a weapon, but as a pattern breaker, pulling her opponent wide off the court and opening angles that were not there before, and combining that with her low, slicing backhand that stays almost skimming the grass, forcing awkward contact and breaking rhythm. And slowly the match stopped being controlled by momentum and started being controlled by intention, point by point, game by game, until the second set was hers at 6-3. And that shift was not just tactical, it was psychological. Because suddenly the player who looked like she was falling into the same pattern was now the one dictating how the match would be played. And that is where the real pressure begins in a final like this. Because once momentum resets, everything becomes a test of nerve, and the third set started exactly like that, with tension immediately returning when her opponent broke serve early and went up 2-1. And in that moment, the entire match seemed to lean back toward the old storyline, the curse narrative, the previous losses, the pattern everyone was expecting to repeat. But instead of collapsing under that weight, she responded immediately, breaking back, refusing to let the gap grow. And from that point, the set stopped being about runs of games and started becoming a pure mental war where every hold mattered. Every service game felt like a survival test, and neither player could fully escape pressure until the scoreboard reached 5-5 and everything tightened even further, because at that stage there is no longer room for rhythm or comfort, only execution under pressure. And every point becomes amplified as if it carries the weight of the entire match. And when she stepped into the 11th game of the set at 6-5, the entire stadium felt that shift where silence becomes louder than noise, where every bounce of the ball feels slow, and where the outcome of a single service game can define years of effort. And yet, despite all of that pressure, she stayed locked in, not rushing, not hesitating, choosing her moments carefully, trusting her patterns, trusting her serve, trusting her ability to construct points even when everything around her was tightening. And finally, she closed it out 7-5 in the third set. And in that moment, the entire narrative collapsed, because the so-called Czech curse that had followed her for years no longer existed in that reality. It had been broken not through luck or shortcuts, but through sustained pressure, endurance, and execution in the most difficult moments of the match. And what makes this victory even more significant is that it was not an isolated performance. Because when you zoom out and look at the entire week leading up to this final, you see a player who was not just surviving matches, but controlling them in different ways. 5 matches played, 0 losses. A combination of straight-set dominance and long 3-set battles that tested her physically and mentally, including a semifinal that was interrupted multiple times due to rain delays, forcing her to leave the court while leading, sit in a locker room for long stretches, and then come back and immediately re-enter competitive intensity without losing focus, which is one of the hardest challenges in tennis because momentum is extremely fragile during interruptions and many players struggle to regain rhythm. But she handled it differently, returning with clarity, closing out key moments under pressure, and proving that her mental resilience had reached a level where external disruption was no longer a deciding factor. And that is why this title carries meaning beyond just one tournament win, because she did not just win matches, she demonstrated control in chaos. And when you expand the perspective even further, the historical significance becomes even clearer, because she became the first Filipino player in history to win the Birmingham Open, placing her name on a trophy that has been lifted by some of the biggest legends in tennis. And that alone changes perception permanently, because it moves a player from potential to proven. And on top of that, this is already her second WTA 125 title, showing that her success is not a one-time breakthrough, but part of a growing pattern across different conditions. First proving herself on hard courts and now on grass, which is widely considered one of the most technically demanding and unpredictable surfaces in tennis, where small adjustments make massive differences. And players who succeed here often have a game style that translates to higher levels. And now the attention immediately shifts forward because there is no break in momentum. As she moves into Queen's Club, a WTA 500 level event where the competition becomes sharper, the opponents become more experienced, and the pressure becomes significantly higher, but she will not be entering as an unknown qualifier anymore. She will be entering as a champion in form, someone who has just proven she can handle pressure on grass courts, and that changes everything about how opponents prepare for her. Because confidence built through winning at this level is not something that fades easily. And with Wimbledon just around the corner, the timing of this surge becomes even more important because grass seasons are short, opportunities are limited, and momentum plays a far bigger role than ranking in determining who makes deep runs. And that is why conversations are already starting to shift toward a new narrative, not about whether she belongs at this level, but about how far she can actually go when everything is clicking at the right time. Because when a player breaks a long-standing psychological barrier, survives multiple high-pressure situations in 1 week, and finds peak form exactly as the biggest tournaments approach, it rarely ends with just one title. It usually signals the beginning of a much bigger rise. And right now, everything about her game, her mindset, and her timing suggests that this is not the peak of her journey, but the early stage of a rise that could completely redefine her position in the sport. And what happens next at Queen's Club and then at Wimbledon will ultimately decide whether this was simply a breakthrough week or the beginning of a long-term presence among the elite players on tour. But one thing is already clear beyond doubt. She is no longer just participating in these events. She is actively shaping them. And that shift alone is enough to change how every opponent will see her from this point forward.